The morning of July 17, 2005 did not begin as an event that anyone in Santa Cruz would later remember. It followed the same quiet pattern that had shaped countless training days along the California coast, the kind of routine that built athletes slowly and invisibly, far from headlines and far from certainty. At the center of that routine was Avery Quinn Hale, 19 years old, an open water swimmer whose name had just started to circulate within competitive circles across the West Coast. She was not yet a national figure, not yet someone whose face appeared on posters or television segments, but among coaches and regional selectors, there was a consistent recognition that she was moving in the right direction, that her endurance was improving, that she belonged in conversations about Olympic trials. Avery's life was anchored in Santa Cruz, a coastal town where the ocean defined both opportunity and risk. Her father, Darren Hale, had spent decades building a modest diving operation that serviced local fishermen, recreational divers, and occasional research teams. The business never expanded beyond what he could manage directly, and it never needed to. It provided stability, familiarity, and a deep understanding of the waters that shaped their lives. For Avery, those waters were not simply a place to train. They were a system she understood with precision, a route she had memorized through repetition, a challenge that had become part of her identity. Her training course had remained unchanged for years. It stretched from the Santa Cruz wharf out toward a distant buoy positioned beyond the usual recreational zone, then looped back in a demanding circuit that tested both stamina and consistency. It was not a course designed for visibility. It offered no crowd, no immediate recognition, only the quiet validation of distance completed and time recorded. Darren had followed her in a small support boat for most of her early training, maintaining a distance that allowed him to observe without interfering. That arrangement had ended 6 months before the day everything changed. Avery had made a deliberate decision to train alone, to remove what she believed was an unnecessary safety net, to align her preparation with the conditions she would face in higher-level competition. The transition had been gradual but firm. Darren had not resisted openly, but he had not accepted it easily. The ocean did not reward independence with certainty, and he understood the variables that could shift without warning. Still, Avery's insistence had not come from recklessness. It came from a belief that progress required isolation, that the discipline she was building needed to be hers alone. Over time, the new routine settled into place. She left at dawn, followed the same path, and returned within a predictable window. Each successful session reinforced the decision. On July 17th, that pattern held until it didn't. Avery entered the water under conditions that presented no immediate concern. The timing, the tide, the visibility, all aligned with what had become standard for her schedule. There were no reports of unusual currents, no warnings issued that morning, no indication that the route carried any greater risk than it had the day before. The hours passed, and the expected return did not occur. Darren's initial response did not carry panic. It carried calculation. Delays happened. Training times fluctuated. But as minutes extended beyond the familiar margin, that calculation shifted. By the time the delay could no longer be rationalized, the search had already begun. Calls were made, coordinates were relayed, and local rescue units moved quickly into action. The area between the wharf and the buoy became the center of an expanding grid, each segment examined with the assumption that Avery could still be located. The first day produced nothing. No sighting, no equipment, no disturbance that could be traced back to her presence. The second day expanded the perimeter. Boats moved farther out, divers entered the water, and aerial support scanned the surface. Still nothing. The absence of evidence did not clarify the situation. It deepened it. The ocean did not provide answers when it held them. Weeks passed, and the search shifted from active rescue to recovery. That transition carried an unspoken conclusion that the official reports would later confirm. The most probable explanation, supported by precedent and by the nature of open water swimming, was that Avery had encountered a condition she could not overcome. Fatigue, an unexpected current, a moment of miscalculation. The ocean had taken swimmers before, including those with experience. It was a conclusion that required no further proof once time had removed the possibility of survival. Darren did not adopt that conclusion. Not immediately and not later. The absence of a body, the absence of equipment, the absence of any fragment that could anchor the event in physical reality, left space that he refused to close. The official narrative settled around him, accepted by authorities, reinforced by the lack of contradiction, but it never replaced the question that remained unresolved in his mind. Santa Cruz moved forward in the way coastal towns often do. The story faded from daily conversation, reduced to a reference point, a cautionary mention within the swimming community. Avery's name did not become a headline beyond the region. She had not yet reached the level of recognition that would have extended the search into national focus. Her disappearance remained local, contained, and ultimately classified. For Darren, time did not create distance. It created repetition. Each day after the search was formally concluded, he returned to the water. Not with the structure of a coordinated effort, not with the support of agencies or teams, but with the same knowledge of the coastline that had guided his work for decades. The route expanded gradually, extending beyond the original training path, reaching areas that had not been prioritized during the official search. The pattern became fixed, replacing everything else that had once defined his routine. The event that had begun as an ordinary training session in 2005 settled into something unresolved, something that refused to complete itself within the explanation that had been assigned to it. Avery Quinn Hale had not returned that morning. That fact remained unchanged. What had happened between her departure and that absence remained unknown, suspended in a space where certainty had been replaced by assumption, and where one person continued to search without accepting the conclusion that had already been written. Time did not move forward for Darren Hale in any way that resembled healing. It reorganized itself around a single purpose, stripping away everything that had once defined routine, obligation, and identity. By the end of 2005, the diving business that had sustained him for decades no longer operated with consistency. Clients drifted away, schedules were missed, and the steady flow of work that once anchored his days collapsed into something irregular and unreliable. None of it altered the one pattern that remained fixed. Each day began with the same direction, the same coordinates, the same refusal to accept that Avery's absence could be explained by probability alone. The official investigation had closed with language that left no room for alternatives. The report cited environmental variables, physical limits, and statistical precedent. It placed Avery's disappearance within a category that did not require further inquiry. The ocean, as it had done before, had taken someone without leaving a trace. For most people in Santa Cruz, the explanation carried a quiet finality. It aligned with what they understood about risk, about open water, about the thin margin between control and loss. Over time, Avery's name moved out of active conversation and into memory, referenced only when necessary, rarely examined. Darren never adjusted to that shift. The absence of physical evidence became the foundation of his resistance. No gear recovered, no fragments identified, no interruption in the surface pattern that could be tied directly to Avery's final moments. The lack of confirmation did not provide comfort. It sustained doubt. It left a gap that the official narrative could not close, and Darren refused to fill it with assumption. Through 2006 and 2007, the pattern intensified rather than weakened. The areas he covered extended beyond the original training route, reaching sections of Monterey Bay that had not been part of the coordinated search. He began to map his own grid, dividing the coastline into segments based on depth, current flow, and underwater structure. The knowledge he had accumulated over decades of diving transformed into a methodical system. It was not guided by evidence. It was guided by the belief that something had been missed, that the search had ended too soon, that the answer existed somewhere within reach if the effort continued long enough. Financial strain followed predictably. Equipment required maintenance, fuel costs accumulated, and without consistent income, the margins narrowed. Darren sold portions of the business gradually, not as a single decision but as a sequence of necessary adjustments. Contracts were transferred, assets reduced, responsibilities relinquished. What remained was the ability to continue diving. Everything else became secondary. By 2008, the pattern had lost any connection to expectation. It was no longer driven by the anticipation of a result. It had become a form of persistence that existed independently of outcome. The search no longer needed justification. It no longer required validation from others. It continued because stopping would have meant accepting a conclusion that Darren still refused to recognize. Early 2009 did not introduce a change in direction. It introduced a shift in distance. The areas closer to Santa Cruz had been covered repeatedly, revisited under different conditions, examined from multiple angles. Darren began to push farther south along the coastline, moving beyond the zones that had been prioritized during the initial response. The decision did not come from new information. It came from the simple recognition that the known areas had yielded nothing, and that the unknown remained untested. In March of that year, during a dive that extended beyond his usual southern boundary, something altered the pattern that had remained unchanged for nearly 4 years. It did not arrive as a clear answer or a visible confirmation. It appeared as an anomaly, a detail that did not belong to the environment Darren had come to know with precision. The object was fixed to the lower structure of a buoy that had not been part of Avery's original training route. It was positioned far enough from the established course to be considered outside the relevant search area, which explained why it had not been examined earlier. The attachment was deliberate, secured in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. When Darren brought the object to the surface, recognition did not occur immediately. Time had altered its appearance. Exposure had worn down its exterior, and the casing showed signs of prolonged contact with salt water and weather. But the shape, the design, and the configuration aligned with something familiar. It was a camera, a waterproof action camera, similar to the one he had insisted Avery carry during her training sessions. The confirmation came from a detail that had not been affected by time. A small marking, placed on the back of the device, remained visible despite the wear. It was a personal identifier Darren had added himself, a simple modification intended to distinguish the camera from others of the same model. The moment did not resolve anything. It shifted everything. For 4 years, the search had operated without a single physical link to Avery's final day. Now that link existed, not as a conclusion but as a connection. The camera had been with her. It had been present at the point where her routine ended, and it had remained in a location that had never been part of the official explanation. Darren did not attempt to interpret what the discovery meant. He did not construct a theory or assign it a place within the narrative that had been established. He recognized only one fact with certainty. The assumption that had defined the case for 4 years no longer stood unchallenged. The device was intact enough to suggest that the data it contained might still be recoverable. That possibility introduced something that had been absent since 2005. Not hope in the abstract sense, but a tangible path forward. Evidence that could be examined, analyzed, and understood. The routine that had defined Darren's life for nearly 4 years did not end with the discovery. It changed direction. The search that had been confined to the ocean now moved toward something that could be seen, reviewed, and interpreted. For the first time since Avery Quinn-Hale failed to return from her training session in July 2005, there was something that could speak for what had happened. And whatever it contained would determine whether the past 4 years had been defined by loss alone, or by something that had yet to be uncovered. The camera did not change anything on its own. It did not explain, it did not resolve, and it did not offer comfort. It existed as a piece of evidence that had survived where nothing else had, and that alone forced a reopening of a moment that had been sealed for 4 years. Darren Hale carried it into the Santa Cruz Police Department with a level of focus that had not been present in any of his previous visits. The case had long since been inactive, reassigned, reduced to a file number that no longer demanded attention. The presence of the device altered that status immediately. The technician assigned to review the evidence approached it with a methodical process that followed protocol rather than urgency. The casing was documented, photographed, and examined for external damage before any attempt was made to access its contents. The battery had failed completely, its condition consistent with prolonged exposure and inactivity. The memory card, however, remained structurally intact. That detail became the only point that mattered. Data recovery did not happen instantly. The files had to be extracted, duplicated, and verified to ensure that the original content remained preserved for evidentiary purposes. Darren remained in the room throughout the process, not as an observer seeking explanation, but as someone who understood that whatever existed on that device would define the direction of everything that followed. For 4 years, there had been no record of Avery's final hours. Now there was a possibility that those hours had been documented. When the first video file opened, the shift was immediate and absolute. Avery appeared on the screen in a way that had not been possible since 2005. Not as a photograph, not as a memory, but as a recorded presence that existed independently of interpretation. The image confirmed what Darren had never accepted otherwise. On the day she disappeared, she had been alive, stable, and fully engaged in the routine that had defined her training. The footage showed her at the buoy, positioning the camera with deliberate intention. The act suggested planning, not improvisation. She had intended to document her session, to create a record of her performance that could be reviewed later. That detail alone disrupted the simplicity of the original assumption. A swimmer who anticipated completion did not align easily with the conclusion that had been assigned to her disappearance. The second segment of the recording extended that contradiction. Avery remained near the buoy, continuing to document her progress. The tone of the recording indicated focus rather than distress, evaluation rather than uncertainty. There was no indication of immediate risk, no sign of environmental conditions that would justify the outcome that had been concluded. Then the sequence changed. Another individual entered the frame. The appearance was not abrupt or concealed. It occurred in a way that suggested normal interaction, the kind of encounter that could happen in open water without raising concern. The individual identified himself as Evan Mercer. The introduction did not carry any immediate significance beyond the fact that it existed. For 4 years, Avery had been presumed alone at the time of her disappearance. The footage established that she had not been. The interaction continued without escalation. The presence of another swimmer at that distance from shore was unusual, but not impossible. The conversation that followed indicated familiarity with the environment, a level of comfort that suggested experience. Avery did not react with alarm. She responded as someone accustomed to managing her own conditions, someone who evaluated situations based on immediate evidence rather than assumption. The recording captured a decision point without emphasizing it. The suggestion of a race, framed within the context of training, introduced a change in direction. Avery accepted. The two individuals moved out of the camera's field of view, leaving the device to record an empty segment of water that extended beyond the moment of departure. The absence that followed carried a different weight than the absence that had defined the past 4 years. It was not empty in the same way. It was positioned after a sequence that contradicted the established narrative. Avery had not vanished without context. She had left the frame with another person, under conditions that appeared controlled and voluntary. Time passed within the recording without further interaction. The camera continued to capture the same fixed position, the same limited perspective, until a new element entered the frame. A vessel crossed the field at a distance that prevented clear identification, but not complete anonymity. The lower portion of the hull was visible long enough to register a detail that would become critical. A logo. The technician paused the footage and isolated the segment. Enhancement tools were applied to clarify the image, but the result remained partially obscured. Even so, the design was distinct enough to be recognized. A stylized wave accompanied by text that aligned with a known entity operating along the California coast. Pacific Crest Marine Logistics. The name did not immediately connect to Avery. It connected to infrastructure, to transport, to an industry that operated parallel to the environment in which she trained. But its presence in the footage created a link that had not existed before. The company had not been part of the original investigation. There had been no reason to consider it. Now it existed within the same frame as the last recorded moment of Avery's presence. The remainder of the footage provided no further clarification. Avery did not return to the buoy. The individual identified as Evan Mercer did not reappear. the vessel moved beyond the frame, leaving behind a recording that transitioned from evidence to absence without explanation. The data did not answer the question that had remained unresolved for 4 years. It replaced that question with a different one. Avery Quinn Hale had not been alone on July 17, 2005. And whatever had happened after she left that frame had involved more than the ocean. The footage did not remain confined to the lab where it had been recovered. Within hours of the initial review, it was duplicated, logged into evidence, and formally attached to a case that had not seen movement in years. Detective Lillian Cross, who had originally handled Avery Quinn Hale's disappearance in 2005, was notified that new material had been introduced. The call did not come with speculation or interpretation. It came with a simple statement. There was video from the day Avery vanished, and it showed another person. Cross did not respond with surprise. Cases like this rarely reopened with clarity, and when they did, the process demanded restraint. She reviewed the footage in full, not once but multiple times, isolating sequences, identifying transitions, and documenting every detail that could be verified independently. The presence of Evan Mercer altered the structure of the case immediately. Avery had not been alone, which meant the original conclusion, an isolated accident, no longer stood as the only viable explanation. The second element, the vessel marked with the Pacific Crest Marine Logistics logo, introduced a different level of complexity. Unlike Mercer, whose identity could be treated as an individual lead, the company represented an organization with infrastructure, personnel, and a documented presence along the California coast. Could not be approached through assumption. It required confirmation. The first step was verification. Pacific Crest Marine Logistics existed as a legitimate business entity, registered, licensed, and active within the region. Its operations included marine transport, equipment supply, and support services for water-based industries. There were no immediate red flags in its public records. No history of violations that would connect it to criminal activity. No open investigations that would justify suspicion. On paper, it operated within the boundaries expected of a company in its field. That did not eliminate its relevance. It positioned it as something that required careful handling. Darren Hale did not approach the situation with the same restraint. The presence of the logo had created a direct line in his mind, one that connected the company to the last recorded moment of his daughter's life. For him, the footage was not a piece of evidence to be processed. It was a confirmation that something had occurred outside the narrative he had been asked to accept. He did not wait for the investigation to expand formally. He acted on the information as it existed. The opportunity presented itself through a local event scheduled in San Jose, a fundraising gathering organized around youth athletics and community sponsorships. Pacific Crest Marine Logistics appeared on the list of participating organizations. Their involvement aligned with their public image, a company that supported development programs, provided resources to emerging athletes, and maintained a visible presence within that network. Darren attended the event with a singular objective: not to gather general information, not to observe from a distance, but to identify whether the company's connection to the footage extended beyond coincidence. The environment offered access without suspicion. Sponsors were expected to interact, to explain their role, to present themselves as contributors to the community. The company's booth operated within those expectations. Representatives engaged with attendees, outlined their services, and reinforced the narrative that defined their brand. It was structured, controlled, and consistent with what their public profile suggested. Nothing about it, at a surface level, contradicted legitimacy. The shift occurred when Darren introduced a variable that had not been anticipated. He referenced the name Evan Mercer. He referenced the vessel captured in the footage. He presented the image taken from the video as a point of inquiry rather than accusation. The reaction did not match the setting. It was not overt. It did not escalate into confrontation, but it broke the consistency that had defined their presentation up to that moment. The responses became less direct. The clarity that had characterized their explanations dissolved into generalities. Questions that should have been answered with straightforward information were redirected, deferred, or reframed. Darren did not interpret the change as uncertainty. He recognized it as avoidance. The interaction ended without resolution. The representatives did not provide the information he had sought, and they did not acknowledge any connection to the name he had introduced. Under normal circumstances, that would have marked the end of the exchange. Within the structure of a formal investigation, it would have been documented and revisited through official channels. Darren did not leave it there. He observed what followed. The representatives who had engaged with him did not return to their previous behavior. Their focus shifted. Communication between them became more frequent, less visible to the attendees around them. The structure of the booth, which had remained stable throughout the event, began to change. Materials were gathered, equipment was packed, and the presence that had been maintained for public engagement began to withdraw earlier than scheduled. The decision to leave was not explained. It did not need to be. It was visible. Darren recognized the timing for what it was. The departure occurred immediately after the interaction that had introduced the name Evan Mercer and the image from the footage. It was not aligned with the event schedule. It was aligned with the disruption of a controlled environment. The conclusion formed without the need for confirmation. Something within that exchange had triggered a response that the company had not anticipated. Whether it was the name, the image, or the combination of both, it had been enough to alter their behavior. That was no longer consistent with coincidence. Darren moved before the gap between action and opportunity could close. He left the event space without returning to the general area, without engaging with anyone else, without introducing delay into a sequence that had already begun to unfold. The representatives had not disappeared. They had transitioned, and whatever that transition led to would define whether the connection he had identified existed beyond the footage. The investigation, as it had been structured through official channels, remained in process. Documentation, verification, and procedural steps continued within the system that governed it. Darren operated outside that structure, driven by a timeline that no longer allowed for delay. For 4 years, the search had produced nothing. Now, within a single day, it had produced a name, a company, and a reaction that could not be dismissed. He did not return to Santa Cruz that night with questions. He followed the only direction that had ever mattered: forward. The decision to follow did not come from impulse. It came from a pattern Darren Hale had learned to trust over years spent navigating uncertainty. The reaction at the event had broken the structure that defined normal behavior, and once that structure failed, everything that followed became part of the same sequence. The representatives from Pacific Crest Marine Logistics did not leave casually. They left with purpose, and that purpose created a direction Darren could not ignore. He maintained distance as their vehicle moved north along the coastal route, careful not to collapse the space between observation and exposure. The timing mattered. The margin between being unnoticed and being detected was narrow, and once crossed, it could not be reversed. Darren understood that without needing to calculate it consciously. The same awareness that had guided him through years of diving now governed his movement on land. The route shifted away from the main access roads sooner than expected. Instead of returning toward populated areas or established facilities, the vehicle turned toward a section of coastline that had no active commercial use. The turn was not marked in a way that suggested routine traffic. It indicated familiarity rather than public access. Darren followed without accelerating the pattern, allowing the distance to absorb the transition. The location that emerged at the end of that route did not match the operational profile of a functioning marine logistics company. There were no active indicators of standard business activity, no visible infrastructure aligned with ongoing operations. What existed instead was a structure that had been removed from regular use, a place that no longer served a declared purpose. That distinction mattered. It separated the company's public identity from the environment Darren now observed. The vehicle did not remain isolated for long. Additional individuals were already present, their movements coordinated in a way that suggested expectation rather than coincidence. The arrival of the Pacific Crest representatives did not initiate activity. It joined an existing sequence. That detail eliminated the possibility that the location was incidental. It was part of something planned. Darren positioned himself outside the immediate range of visibility, maintaining a line of observation that allowed him to track movement without becoming part of it. He did not need to hear every word to understand the structure of what was happening. The pattern was clear. Equipment was being transferred. Communication between individuals followed a controlled rhythm, not casual, not exploratory, but directed. The first indication that confirmed the scale of what he was witnessing came through sound, not sight. The presence of voices that did not belong to the group managing the operation disrupted the pattern. They were not aligned with the instructions being given. They did not match the tone of coordination. They introduced something else, something restrained, controlled, and contained. The realization did not arrive gradually. It formed immediately, without the need for interpretation. There were women being held. The structure of the interaction that followed reinforced that conclusion. Commands were issued, not requests. Movement occurred under direction, not choice. The distinction was absolute. Whatever this operation represented, it did not operate within any legal or voluntary framework. It functioned through control. Darren did not attempt to move closer. He did not attempt to intervene. The situation did not allow for that. The number of individuals present, the organization of their actions, and the controlled environment they maintained created a boundary that could not be crossed without consequence. The decision to remain outside that boundary was not hesitation. It was recognition. A vessel approached the location shortly after, aligning with the pattern already in motion. Its arrival did not introduce uncertainty. It confirmed that the operation extended beyond the land-based environment Darren was observing. The transition from ground to water was executed without disruption, as if it had been performed multiple times before. The individuals who had arrived in the vehicle coordinated with those already present, transferring control from one stage to another without delay. The women were moved onto the vessel. Darren did not see their faces clearly. He did not need to. The presence alone was enough to establish the connection he had been searching for. The timeline aligned. The structure aligned. The scale aligned. For years. The same duration that had defined Avery's absence was now embedded in the conversation that unfolded among the men coordinating the operation. The reference was not indirect. It was stated with a level of familiarity that suggested continuity. This was not a new development. It had been maintained. Darren's understanding shifted from possibility to certainty. Avery had not disappeared into the ocean. She had been taken. And if the structure he was witnessing had remained active for 4 years, then the assumption that she was gone no longer held the same weight. The realization did not bring relief. It brought urgency. The vessel departed with the same precision that had defined its arrival. There was no hesitation, no deviation from the pattern that had been established. The operation closed behind it, leaving the location to return to a state that concealed what had just occurred. The individuals remaining began to disperse, their roles within that sequence complete. Darren did not follow the vessel immediately. He did not have the capacity to intercept it alone, and attempting to do so without support would have ended the only advantage he had, knowledge. Instead, he withdrew from the position he had maintained, moving back along the same path that had brought him there, carrying with him the information that had transformed the case completely. The call to Detective Lillian Cross did not contain speculation. It did not contain uncertainty. It delivered a direct account of what had been observed, structured in a way that allowed immediate action. There was no time to revisit procedure, no time to question whether the situation justified escalation. The presence of multiple victims, the coordination of the operation, and the confirmed connection to Pacific Crest Marine Logistics demanded response. Cross did not hesitate. Units were mobilized, communication channels opened, and the investigation shifted from analysis to active intervention. The case that had remained dormant for 4 years now moved with a speed that matched the urgency Darren had carried alone for that entire period. The information he had gathered did not answer every question. It did not reveal the full structure of the operation or identify every individual involved. But it established one fact with absolute clarity. Avery Quinn Hale had been alive after the moment she disappeared, and whatever had taken her had not stopped. The response from law enforcement did not unfold slowly. Once Darren Hale's report was delivered and verified at a basic level, the case transitioned from dormant investigation to active operation. Detective Lillian Cross did not treat the information as a single lead. She treated it as confirmation that a system was already in motion, one that required immediate disruption before it could relocate or disappear entirely. The details Darren provided: location, number of individuals, timing of the vessel departure, formed a structure that could be acted on without delay. Coordination extended beyond the Santa Cruz Police Department within minutes. Harbor patrol units were alerted, the Coast Guard was brought into the loop, and aerial support was requested to establish a broader surveillance range over the coastal area. The objective was clear and narrowly defined: locate the vessel Darren had identified, track its movement, and intercept before it reached a point where it could no longer be contained. Darren did not step back once the operation began. His knowledge of the coastline, built over decades of diving, shifted from personal search to operational value. Cross did not initially intend to include him in the field response. Protocol favored controlled teams, trained units, and structured communication. But the situation did not allow for ideal conditions. The timeline was already compromised. The individuals involved in the operation Darren had witnessed were not stationary, and every minute that passed increased the likelihood that they would reach a location outside immediate jurisdiction. When Darren insisted on participating, his argument did not center on emotion. It centered on information. He knew the underwater terrain, the hidden routes, the areas where vessels could disappear without leaving obvious traces. That knowledge carried weight in a situation where time and geography intersected with uncertainty. Cross made the decision to allow his presence under strict conditions. He would not lead, he would not act independently, and he would follow direct instruction at every stage. The vessels deployed from the main marina carried more than personnel. They carried urgency that had not existed in the case for 4 years. Communication between units remained constant, structured through channels that relayed position, speed, and direction in real time. The initial coordinates provided by Darren placed the target within a defined range, but that range expanded quickly as the vessel moved away from the abandoned harbor. The first confirmed visual came from aerial support. The description matched: a high-speed craft, consistent with what Darren had observed, moving along a trajectory that aligned with offshore transfer patterns rather than direct coastal navigation. The direction mattered. It indicated intention. The vessel was not returning to a public marina. It was heading toward a secondary point of contact. That contact point revealed itself shortly after. A larger vessel, positioned further offshore, became visible through coordinated tracking. The smaller craft approached it with precision, not as a random encounter but as part of a planned exchange. The pattern Darren had witnessed on land extended seamlessly into open water. There was no hesitation in the movement, no indication that the individuals involved were improvising. They were executing. Cross issued the command to close distance without immediate engagement. The operation required confirmation before escalation. The presence of potential hostages altered the parameters entirely. Any direct confrontation carried risk that extended beyond the suspects. The objective was no longer limited to interception. It had expanded to include extraction. Darren observed the transition through the same lens that had defined his actions since the moment he found the camera. Each element aligned with what he had already concluded. The timeline, the coordination, the structure, it all confirmed that Avery's disappearance had not been an isolated event. It had been part of something sustained, something organized, something that had operated without interruption for years. The next development eliminated any remaining uncertainty. Movement on the larger vessel indicated transfer activity. Individuals were being brought from the smaller craft onto the deck, then directed below. The pattern matched what Darren had witnessed earlier. Control, not cooperation. Direction, not choice. The operation had not ended at the abandoned harbor. It had continued, expanding into a second stage designed to remove the victims from any location that could be reached quickly by authorities. The timing of the law enforcement approach forced a shift in that pattern. The suspects identified the presence of incoming units before the operation could be completed. The reaction was immediate. The larger vessel began to move, attempting to create distance rather than hold position. The smaller craft detached, altering its trajectory in a way that suggested defensive maneuvering rather than escape. Cross did not delay the next command. The operation transitioned from surveillance to engagement. Units accelerated, closing the gap that had been maintained intentionally up to that point. The objective remained unchanged, but the method adjusted to the reality that the suspects were now aware of the threat. What followed did not unfold in a controlled sequence. The smaller craft moved to intercept, positioning itself between the approaching law enforcement vessels and the larger yacht. The intent was clear. It was not attempting to flee. It was attempting to delay. That delay created an opportunity for the primary vessel to execute a contingency. Darren understood the implication before it was confirmed. The coastline in that region contained underwater formations that could be used to disappear without leaving a visible trace. If the suspects moved the victims into those conditions, the operation would reset into a search scenario far more complex than the one they had just disrupted. The confirmation came through observation. Individuals on the larger vessel began preparing for submersion. Equipment was distributed, not randomly but in a sequence that indicated prior planning. The victims were not being kept above water. They were being moved into it. Cross issued immediate directives to accelerate engagement. The risk had escalated beyond containment. It had reached a point where delay meant loss. The distance between the law enforcement vessels and the target closed rapidly, but not before the suspects initiated the final stage of their plan. Figures disappeared below the surface, taking with them whatever advantage remained in the operation. Darren did not wait for instruction at that moment. The pattern he had followed for 4 years aligned with the reality unfolding in front of him. The ocean, which had been assumed to be the cause of loss, had now become the medium of concealment. And somewhere beneath that surface, within a system designed to erase evidence, Avery Quinn Hale still existed as a possibility that had not yet been taken away. The moment the figures disappeared beneath the surface, the structure of the operation fractured into 2 simultaneous realities. Above, law enforcement units continued to close distance with the vessels that remained visible, maintaining pressure on suspects who could still be contained within reach. Below, an entirely different confrontation had already begun, one that operated without visibility, without direct communication, and without margin for delay. The suspects had not moved into the water randomly. They had moved with intention, using a system they understood, one that had likely been used before. Darren Hale did not wait for formal instruction once the pattern became clear. For 4 years, every search had led him into the same medium that now held the only remaining path forward. The difference this time was not the environment. It was the certainty that something existed within it that could be found. The transition from observer to participant did not involve hesitation. It aligned with everything he had done since July 2005, except now the objective was no longer hypothetical. Law enforcement divers entered the water in coordinated sequence. Each unit assigned a defined sector based on the last confirmed positions of the suspects and victims. The limitation was immediate. Visibility, orientation, and communication could not be maintained at the same level as above. Each diver operated within a constrained field, relying on training rather than direct oversight. The suspects understood that limitation. Their movement had been designed to exploit it. The initial engagement below the surface did not resemble a standard pursuit. It resembled a forced collision between 2 groups operating under different constraints. The suspects remained connected to the victims in a way that prevented simple separation. The method was effective. It ensured that any attempt to neutralize a suspect carried immediate risk to the person attached to them. That structure was not improvised. It was deliberate, developed over time, and implemented with precision. Darren located the conflict through pattern rather than sight. The distribution of movement, the disruption within the coordinated approach of the divers, and the concentration of activity in a specific zone indicated where the primary engagement was occurring. He moved toward that point without deviating, not because he could see everything clearly, but because the logic of the situation narrowed the possibilities to a single conclusion. The figures within that zone confirmed what he had already accepted. Multiple individuals were engaged in a struggle that did not resolve quickly or cleanly. The suspects did not attempt to flee in a straight path. They maintained resistance, using both the environment and the victims as barriers against intervention. Law enforcement responded with controlled force, prioritizing separation over elimination. The objective remained unchanged. The victims had to be extracted intact. Darren identified Avery within that conflict not through clarity of appearance, but through alignment of position. The structure of the situation, the number of individuals, and the connections between them reduced the variables. She was there, not as a possibility, not as a theory, but as a presence within a system that had held her for 4 years. The engagement intensified without resolution. The suspects maintained their hold, resisting separation through coordinated movement that suggested prior training or repeated execution. The divers attempting extraction faced a limitation that could not be removed quickly. Direct force risked immediate harm. Indirect methods required time that did not exist. Darren moved into the point of conflict without introducing a new pattern. He did not disrupt the structure of the engagement. He aligned with it, identifying the specific connection that had to be broken to alter the outcome. The individual holding Avery maintained control through equipment that ensured both remained dependent on the same source of air and movement. That connection was not symbolic. It was functional. Breaking it changed everything. The shift did not occur as a gradual transition. It occurred as a decisive interruption of the system that had been holding the situation in place. Once the connection was disrupted, the suspect's control weakened instantly. The reaction was immediate and uncoordinated, creating the opening that law enforcement needed to complete the extraction. The sequence that followed unfolded with a level of speed that had been impossible moments before. Separation was achieved. The suspect lost the ability to maintain resistance under the same conditions. The divers completed the neutralization, securing the individual and preventing further interference. Avery was no longer part of the structure that had held her. Darren's awareness narrowed to a single point. For 4 years, every possibility had ended in absence. Now, for the first time, that absence had been replaced by contact. The recognition did not require confirmation through words or explanation. It existed in the fact that the search had reached its endpoint. Above the surface, the operation continued to evolve. The smaller craft had been contained, its occupants engaged by law enforcement units that had closed the distance during the underwater engagement. The larger vessel remained under pressure, its attempt to relocate disrupted by the loss of control below. The coordination that had defined the operation at its peak no longer held. It had been broken into segments, each forced to respond independently. The suspects who remained above water faced a different outcome. Without the ability to use the victims as leverage, their position weakened rapidly. Law enforcement shifted from containment to control, securing individuals and preventing further movement. The structure that had allowed the operation to function collapsed under the combined pressure of intervention above and below the surface. Darren did not process that collapse in real time. His focus remained fixed on the outcome that had driven every action he had taken since 2005. The extraction of Avery did not resolve everything. It did not erase what had happened over 4 years. But it altered the only question that had mattered. She had not been lost. She had been held. And now, for the first time since the morning she failed to return from her training route, she was no longer beyond reach. The operation did not end at the moment Avery Quinn Hale was separated from the system that had held her. It shifted into a different phase, one that demanded verification, accountability, and a reconstruction of everything that had been hidden for 4 years. The extraction from the water created a point of transition, but it did not close the case. It opened it. Darren Hale's awareness moved through that transition without resistance. For years, every effort had been directed toward a single question. Now that question had been answered, but the answer carried consequences that extended beyond personal resolution. Avery had not disappeared into an unpredictable environment. She had been taken into a controlled one. That distinction required more than acknowledgement. It required explanation. The immediate priority remained medical stabilization and containment of the individuals involved. The suspects who had been intercepted during the operation were secured under federal authority, their identities processed against records that quickly revealed inconsistencies between their public roles and their actual activities. Evan Mercer was among those taken into custody, his presence aligning with the footage recovered from the camera and the sequence that had followed. The larger structure behind him emerged through the same process that had uncovered the company's surface identity. Pacific Crest Marine Logistics existed as a legitimate entity, but its ownership extended beyond operational management into a network controlled by Graham Whitlock. His name did not appear prominently in public-facing materials, but financial records, property holdings, and internal documentation connected him directly to the company's core operations. Whitlock had not been present at the abandoned harbor Darren had followed. He had not needed to be. The structure he had built operated without his physical presence, maintaining control through individuals positioned to execute his directives. The yacht that had served as the second stage of the operation was linked to him through ownership records that were initially obscured but quickly clarified under investigation. The system was not limited to a single incident. Preliminary evidence indicated that multiple individuals had been targeted over an extended period, each selected through channels that appeared legitimate on the surface. Sponsorship programs, training support, equipment provision mechanisms that created access to athletes who operated within isolated training environments. The pattern was consistent. The approach was structured. The victims were not random. Avery's account, once she was stable enough to provide it, confirmed the sequence that had been inferred from the evidence. The encounter with Evan Mercer during her training session had not triggered alarm. It had been positioned within the context of shared activity, framed as a normal interaction between individuals operating in the same environment. The transition from that interaction to controlled movement had occurred without visible escalation, shifting from voluntary engagement to confinement before she had recognized the change. What followed had not been chaotic. It had been controlled, maintained over time through a system that relied on isolation, surveillance, and manipulation. The threat of external consequences directed toward Darren, toward the business he had built, toward every element of her life beyond that system, had been used to enforce compliance. The structure did not require constant physical restraint. It required belief in the consequences of resistance. Avery had remained within that system for 4 years. The 2 other women recovered during the operation provided parallel accounts, each aligning with the same structure, each confirming that the system extended beyond a single case. Their timelines differed, but the method did not. Each had been identified, approached, and removed under conditions that minimized external visibility. Each had been held within a network that prevented detection while maintaining operational continuity. Whitlock's death during the confrontation on the yacht did not end the investigation. It redirected it. Without his direct testimony, the case relied on documentation, financial tracing, and the statements of those who had operated within the system under his authority. Evan Mercer's role, initially positioned as peripheral, expanded under scrutiny. He had not been the architect, but he had been an active participant, facilitating access and movement within the structure his father had created. The legal process that followed did not resolve quickly. It unfolded through federal channels, involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Charges extended beyond individual acts to encompass organized activity, trafficking, and conspiracy. The scope of the case expanded as additional evidence surfaced, connecting Whitlock's operations to a network that had functioned without interruption for years. Darren did not engage with that process as an observer. His involvement had shifted from search to testimony, from independent action to participation within a system designed to establish accountability. He provided the sequence that had led to the operation, the discovery of the camera, the identification of the location, the observation that had triggered intervention. His actions did not define the case. They initiated its final phase. Avery's recovery did not follow a simple trajectory. The time she had spent within that system could not be removed, only addressed. Support structures were established, not as temporary measures but as long-term commitments to rebuild what had been interrupted. The path forward required acknowledgement of what had happened without allowing it to define what remained. The town that had once accepted her disappearance as a closed event now confronted a different reality. The assumption that had provided explanation had been replaced by a truth that demanded reflection. The ocean had not taken Avery Quinn Hale. People had. The distinction mattered beyond the boundaries of the case. It altered how absence was understood, how conclusions were formed, how quickly explanations were accepted when evidence was incomplete. It introduced a question that extended beyond one family, one incident, one timeline. What do we choose to believe when something disappears without a trace? Darren's answer had never changed. For 4 years, it had defined every decision he made, every step he took, every risk he accepted. It had not been based on proof. It had been based on refusal, the refusal to accept an answer that did not account for everything he knew. That refusal had not been comfortable. It had not been supported. It had not been easy to maintain in the face of time, pressure, and isolation. But it had persisted. In the end, it had been enough. The resolution of the case did not restore the years that had been lost. It did not erase the reality of what had occurred, but it established something that could not be taken away. Avery Quinn Hale had been found because someone refused to stop looking when every system around him had already stopped. And sometimes, in a world that moves forward too quickly to question what it leaves behind, the difference between loss and truth comes down to one person deciding that uncertainty is not the same as an ending. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to this story today. Your presence and attention mean more than you may realize, because stories like this are not just meant to be heard. They are meant to be remembered, reflected upon, and carried forward. At its heart, this story reminds us that truth does not always reveal itself easily, and that sometimes the world accepts answers too quickly simply because they are convenient. It shows us that persistence, even when it stands alone, can become the force that brings light into places where darkness has settled for far too long. The lesson we can take from this is simple but powerful. Never lose the courage to question. Never give up when something does not feel right. And never underestimate the strength of someone who refuses to stop searching for the truth. In a world that often moves on too quickly, choosing to care, to hold on, and to keep believing can make all the difference. If you found value in this story and would like to support our channel, you can do so in the simplest ways. Please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future stories. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful and inspiring content to you.